October 3, 1943, at an altitude of 30,000 feet over the cold expanse of the North Sea, a waist gunner aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress pressed his cheek against the chilling metal of a caliber Browning machine gun, every breath he exhaled turning to frost in the freezing air. The bomber's fuselage vibrated with the pulse of its own engines, echoes of distant thunder in his bones, and through the icy wind he saw a Messerschmitt Bf-109 cutting a lethal arc toward his formation. It closed fast, 200 yards out, its black crosses starkly visible on the wings, the canopy glinting in the harsh daylight, and the fighter's guns flashed unmistakably. The gunner's instincts screamed at him to aim forward, to bring the reticle square on that cockpit, but instead his training guided him to do something far more alien. He waited, his finger poised, and aimed behind the fighter. Under his breath, he whispered angles he had learned in the desert months ago. The Browning roared, spitting streams of tracer into the sky, and 2 seconds later, the 109 erupted into a blaze of orange and black, its structure tearing apart in mid-air, metal burning, pieces spinning until they vanished beyond his sight. In that instant, the gunner understood something profound. Survival didn't come from instinct. It came from calculation, from a method called position firing, a concept that contradicted every intuitive principle of shooting, but promised one thing above all: hit or miss. You had a real chance. This idea of aiming where the target had been, not where it was, did not spring fully formed from the minds of combat-seasoned crews. It originated decades earlier in a barren stretch of the Nevada desert, on January 25, 1941, when Colonel Martinez Stenith stepped out of his vehicle onto 60 square miles of nothingness, sand, sagebrush, jackrabbits, and a sky so empty it seemed like a void. The task before him was monumental: to build a training base from the dust up for aerial gunners. The United States had virtually no infrastructure for training men to fire effectively from moving aircraft at high-speed targets. The Army Air Corps needed a standardized curriculum, a way to transform ordinary citizens into aerial marksmen capable of defending bombers flying through enemy territory at hundreds of miles per hour. That desolate parcel of desert would become Las Vegas Army Airfield, a crucible of innovation and grit. Construction crews raised barracks, hangars, and classrooms. Firing ranges grew. Instructors arrived, physicists, ex-marksmen, engineers, and began forging a doctrine from first principles. Their students were farm boys, students, factory workers, men with little more than raw courage and few preconceptions about aerial warfare. The early training started on the ground. Instructors mounted shotguns on fixed platforms, letting students fire at clay pigeons thrown high into the air. That seemed logical: teach them to lead a moving target to anticipate motion. Many students hit their targets, but when they mounted shotguns on the backs of moving trucks and the clay pigeons flew alongside, everything changed. Misses skyrocketed. The students were doing exactly as they had practiced, and still failing. Something profound was wrong. Enter Sergeant Robert Hayes, a former physics student with a Texan drawl and patient precision. He drew diagrams on a blackboard, sketching a bomber traveling at 300 miles per hour and an attacking fighter closing in on a perpendicular path. He explained that the bullet, once fired, retained the forward velocity of the bomber. It did not travel purely sideways, but diagonally, pushed forward by the bomber's momentum. At 300 mph, a bullet aimed to the side would curve so strongly that it could sail ahead of the target in a terrifying arc. To hit, you had to aim far behind. As a demonstration, Hayes held a pendulum, a weight on a string released while walking. The weight did not fall straight down, it trailed behind, carried forward by his motion. He explained, "Your bullets do the same thing." The students watched, stunned, as instinct unraveled before their eyes. What felt wrong made sense. What felt natural was deadly. From that revelation, the doctrine of position firing was born, built on rigorous mathematics, angles, and relative velocity. The curriculum grew brutally efficient. Over 6 weeks, trainees endured ground school on ballistic theory, aircraft recognition, and the mechanics of the Browning machine gun. They learned to field strip and reassemble their weapon blindfolded, preparing for the dark, cramped confines of an aircraft turret. Next came the truck courses. Instructors raised speed, forcing students to refine their aim behind moving targets. Then came towers, manipulation trainers rigged to mimic turrets. Students sat in mock gunnery positions and tracked enemy aircraft pulled on wires, learning to swing, lead, and overshoot, not out of instinct but out of calculation. Next, the Waller trainer. In darkness, gunners watched projected images of fighters on a concave screen, dove and weaved and fired simulated bursts. Their every trigger pull was recorded. Hits, misses, and tracking errors were analyzed in real time. By then, students had begun to internalize what felt unnatural. Following that, the live flights. Actual B-17s and B-24s towing fabric sleeves, each gunner firing color-coded ammunition. After each mission, instructors counted holes, graded accuracy, and forced corrections. The final week was the toughest. Multi-angle simulated attacks, rapid changes, emergency procedures, and final tests. Roughly 20% washed out. Those who graduated earned their silver gunner wings and were assigned to bomber crews, ready to apply what they had learned in the vast, dangerous skies. By mid-1943, Las Vegas churned out 600 trained gunners every 5 weeks. That force was tested in real war. On August 17, 1943, 376 B-17s of the 8th Air Force roared east over Germany. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, strategic targets of extraordinary importance. The skies erupted. Over 400 German fighters, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, even twin-engine fighters with rocket armament rushed the formation. It was chaos. Head-on attacks, 6 o'clock low dives, rockets from distance, overlapping fields of fire. The loss was terrible, 60 heavy bombers in a single mission. But among the carnage, trained gunners made their mark. They shot down approximately 27 enemy fighters with carefully aimed bursts, using that counterintuitive principle learned back in the desert. They didn't simply spray bullets. They calculated deflection, adjusted for bomber speed, trusted their craft, and most importantly, aimed behind. Critics would later note that initial combat claims of hundreds of kills were wildly optimistic, but the verified successes were real, and they validated an entirely new approach. The doctrine was not just theoretical. It saved lives and changed how crewed bombers defended themselves. But the training did not end with mustard bombs and B-17s. American engineers and tacticians watched British developments. The RAF, fighting deep over Europe, had on occasion pioneered early deflection concepts, but lacked a systematic mass-training doctrine. Meanwhile, American scientists and designers sought ways to lighten the cognitive burden of manual calculation. In late 1943, following British breakthroughs, they adapted gyro gun sight technology for bomber turret use. The result was the K-14 sight, a dual reticle system. One reticle remained fixed, the other, powered by a spinning gyroscope and linked to aircraft motion and ballistics calculations, moved to show where the bullets would actually fly, compensating for deflection automatically. When used in combat, it drastically improved hit rates. Gunners no longer had to instantly compute radian tables or mental geometry under fire. The moving reticle did the work, showing precisely where to aim to hit a target in motion. These sights were bulky, complicated, and required the user to estimate the wingspan of the attacking aircraft, a difficult task in the split-second drama of battle. But they worked. Testing in 1944 showed they roughly doubled the accuracy of conventional ring-end bead sights when used by position-trained gunners. As the war pressed on, additional innovations deepened the doctrine. The pinball program was one of the boldest. Bell RP-63 King Cobras were heavily armored, covered in thick Durlan plating, and flown by volunteer pilots in training. Gunners fired frangible bullets, projectiles made of compressed lead and plastic that shattered on impact, at the armored planes. Hits triggered sensors and lights on the pinball aircraft, giving immediate feedback. These simulated real combat maneuvers, dives, high-G slings, beam attacks, unpredictable paths. Gunners who trained against pinballs improved dramatically, their accuracy in combat sky-high compared to those who had only fired at towed sleeves or simulated targets. By early 1945, every gunnery school in the network adopted pinball training, integrating it into curriculum and demanding proficiency from all graduates. Through all of this, a transformation occurred, not just of skill but of mindset. The men who once would have panicked when a fighter appeared at 3 o'clock level now suppressed instinctual urge and trusted their training, their equipment, and their calculations. During combat missions, they applied what they had learned. Upon spotting an attacker, they estimated range, recognized angle, and aimed behind based on tables, charts, and the behavior of their sight. Their trigger finger squeezed in timed bursts. They watched for tracers to strike wings, engines, or fuselage. Sometimes fighters broke off, trailing smoke. Sometimes they went down. And sometimes, though rarely, gunners would look at each other in astonishment, realizing they had done something no untrained soldier could have. They beat physics through discipline. When the war ended in September 1945, the impact of that training program was undeniable. Las Vegas Army Airfield had graduated tens of thousands of gunners. Their skill didn't vanish with the peace. Into the Korean War, B-29 crews carried the same principles of position firing. Against Jet-era Soviet MiG-15s, they used advanced fire control and gyroscopic reticles, but at the core lay the same doctrine. A moving platform requires leading behind. Even today, modern airborne weapons systems rely on the same basic physics. Automated computers calculate lead taking into account relative velocity, but the original insight from the Nevada desert still lies at the heart of it. The projectile inherits your own motion. The legacy of those men and that training lives on at Nellis Air Force Base, which now stands where the old gunnery school once operated. There, the Fighter Weapons School and Thunderbirds carry forward a tradition of precision, discipline, and respect for physics. The dusty desert where gunners once learned to override instinct is now a place of aerial mastery, but the truth they discovered remains. Survival in the skies often demands doing what feels completely wrong. That when you're moving and your target is moving, you don't just lead ahead, you aim behind, trusting mathematics, your training, and the invisible forces of motion, because physics doesn't care what feels natural. It only cares what works. The doctrine of position firing was more than just an academic exercise. It was a crucible in which ordinary men were transformed into experts capable of extraordinary performance under extreme conditions. The early gunners, many of whom had never fired a gun before enlistment, were taught not only to understand physics but to trust it instinctively. Day after day, week after week, they endured drills that felt counterintuitive, unnatural, and sometimes absurd. Standing on moving platforms in the Nevada desert, aiming at clay pigeons that zipped unpredictably across the air, these men learned to let go of instinct and rely on calculation. Each miss and every hit reinforced the lesson. Instinct might guide, but mathematics determines outcomes. By the time these gunners boarded B-17s and B-24s for combat over Europe, they had internalized a principle that could not be unlearned, even under the stress of enemy fire, freezing temperatures, and deafening engine noise. Their minds were trained to see angles, anticipate motion, and understand the unseen paths of bullets. The psychological transformation was as profound as the technical one. Soldiers learned to override the natural human response to point and fire, to trust training over fear, to trust calculation over reflex. The impact of this transformation extended far beyond individual survival. American strategic bombing campaigns relied heavily on daylight raids, a tactic previously considered nearly suicidal due to the vulnerability of unescorted bombers to fighter attack. The development of competent aerial gunners through systematic position firing instruction allowed the U.S. Army Air Forces to pursue this strategy with a level of confidence previously unattainable. These gunners became force multipliers. Their ability to inflict damage on enemy fighters reduced bomber losses, improved mission success rates, and ultimately allowed the United States to exert enormous pressure on German industrial targets. The lessons learned in the Nevada desert echoed across multiple theaters of war, influencing the tactics and training of the air forces involved in every major aerial campaign. The principles, once considered counterintuitive, became doctrine, taught to thousands of men who, in turn, trained others, creating a legacy of competence that persisted through subsequent conflicts, including Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Training was rigorous, unrelenting, and methodical. Ground school, manipulation trainers, Waller trainers, live aerial exercises, and the pinball program were integrated into a comprehensive 6-week curriculum that turned raw recruits into skilled operators. Each step in the process built upon the last, reinforcing position firing principles and gradually breaking down ingrained, instinctual responses. The introduction of advanced gyroscopic sights, adapted from British designs, further enhanced the gunner's ability to apply theoretical knowledge in practical combat. These sights did not eliminate the need for understanding physics. They augmented it, allowing gunners to focus on tracking, timing, and firing, while the sight adjusted for deflection automatically. The combination of rigorous training, technological innovation, and relentless practice produced an aerial gunner corps unparalleled in history, capable of performing under conditions that would overwhelm untrained individuals. The effectiveness of American bomber gunners in World War II was validated in combat over Europe, where fully trained crews used position firing to repel attacks from hundreds of experienced Luftwaffe pilots. On missions such as the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, despite suffering significant losses, the trained gunners inflicted enough casualties to demonstrate the value of systematic instruction and disciplined application of physics. They turned instinct into strategy, chaos into predictable engagement, and raw fear into calculated action. These lessons, hard-won in the Nevada desert and over European skies, created a paradigm shift in aerial warfare. Gunners were no longer merely passengers with guns. They were critical combatants whose skill could decisively influence the survival of the entire formation. The long-term implications of position firing extended beyond World War II. The principles were adapted and refined for jet aircraft, illustrating that the foundational physics of motion, velocity, and trajectory transcended the technology of any single era. Korean War B-29 gunners applied similar principles against MiG-15 jet fighters, and modern fighter pilots continue to use advanced computer-assisted targeting systems based on the same counterintuitive truths discovered in 1941. The underlying concept remains unchanged. A projectile fired from a moving aircraft inherits that aircraft's velocity. To effectively engage a target, one must consider not only the target's motion, but also one's own. This fundamental principle informs the design of modern avionics, automated firing systems, and pilot training programs worldwide. The discipline of understanding and compensating for relative motion, first instilled in the minds of gunners at Las Vegas Army Airfield, endures as a cornerstone of aerial combat training. The Nevada desert, once a site of experimentation and intense human transformation, has evolved into Nellis Air Force Base, a modern hub of combat aviation training. The echoes of history resonate in the Thunderbird's aerial demonstrations, in the fighter weapons school's rigorous curriculum, and in every pilot and gunner taught to anticipate, calculate, and act in the three-dimensional chessboard of the skies. The truth discovered in the desert, that motion profoundly affects trajectory, that instinct can mislead, and that careful calculation can save lives, remains engraved in military doctrine. American gunners learned to override instinct, to aim behind, to trust mathematics, and to apply training with disciplined precision. The hard-won knowledge of position firing transformed ordinary men into experts, reshaped strategic bombing doctrine, and set the foundation for modern aerial combat. Physics, as it had been in 1941 and through the crucible of World War II, does not bend to intuition. It only bends to understanding. And in mastering this, American bomber gunners achieved what many believed impossible. They turned the skies themselves into a calculated advantage, where bullets met their targets not by chance, but by principle, training, and disciplined execution.